So I'm going to start by just walking through a little bit of the Tilth website, because that really, I think, is just covers kind of the resources we offer for your gardening and other food adventures. And it's also just a way, if you haven't been to the website, just to kind of see how you get through that. So I'm going to share my screen here. And that's my PowerPoint. Okay. So hopefully everybody can see our website. It's tilthalliance.org. As an organization, a nonprofit, we've been around in one form or another for about 50 years. We're actually celebrating a 50-year anniversary. We're having a big event at the Rainier Beach Farm called Cultivate and Celebrate this summer. So you can see about that on our website, but long time. And it's different organizations over the years. I started it when it was called Seattle Tilth, which was really doing urban gardening, but we also have partnered, and we do work across the state with farmers. So promoting urban or organic agriculture, regenerative agriculture, but we also still do a lot of work in the Seattle area and also the regional area around building a better food future, as our website says there. So the first area I'm going to show you is near and dear to my heart, which is take a class. And so we offer a lot of classes on all different kinds of topics. I'm just kind of showing the upcoming ones: companion planting, drip irrigation, which I'm going to be teaching pretty soon if you're interested in that. And then, so some of them are gardening or like container gardening, and then others are like make herbal infusions, or we have guest and speakers about growing mushrooms and fermentation. So it's more than just gardening. A lot of it is also like, what do you do with that harvest, or related topics. And when you're trying to pick out a class, you can, filter by topic. They're usually offered. These days, we've actually switched mostly back to in-person. We still have some that are online because that can be convenient, but most of our classes are pretty hands-on, and there are times where you just can't quite get that same experience over Zoom. So a lot of these are in person, either at the Rainier Beach Farm in South Seattle or the Good Shepherd Center in Wallingford. Also occasionally over at a garden space in Kirkland, and then at Bradner Gardens in the Mount Baker neighborhood as well. So a few different spots where we offer them. Many or most are usually 2-hour classes. But then we have some like Fundamentals of Organic Gardening, which is a really great sort of like 5-hour, just getting started with organic gardening. So that's a little bit longer. We also have some that last for several weeks, where you take several sessions: comprehensive organic gardening, or year-round gardener, which meets once a month or so throughout the year. So a lot of different options. They do cost money. We try and offer reduced price and BIPOC solidarity tickets as well to try and make them accessible. But this is also how we try and pay living, if not thriving, wages to all of our employees. So there is a price there, but we try and do our best to make it affordable for folks. I think you get a great value for what you do. So anyway, so check out our classes. If you have young kiddos, you might be interested in youth programs as well. So, oops, now our website's not working. There it goes. So a lot of those are after school camps. Some of them are family camps. If you have like like a toddler and you want to spend an hour with your toddler in the garden, as well as summer camps, which tend to fill up pretty fast. We might have some that are still open, but lots of summer camps, and then lots of work with schools. You can do field trips to our gardens, and so a lot of work with youth. Another program that I'll mention here, which it's its own program, it's called Garden Hotline, but we staff it. So there's Laura and Melissa. This is a free resource for anyone, but especially Seattle King County. You can call them if you just have like a gardening question, like what's this pest, or what's going on with my tomatoes, or how do I grow tomatoes? Like whatever your question is, they give them a call and they will answer it. Or you can send them an email. You can take a picture. It's just a great resource. They're wonderful, friendly people that know a lot. I always love listening in on their questions they get, like talking about stink bugs or whatever is going around. They also will be out in the community sharing resources, and they just offer a lot. So just to say, that's a really fabulous resource that we always recommend. What else? Another great thing to know about us is that you can volunteer if you want to learn by doing, and spend some time at any of our gardens or other spaces. There's a volunteer page. If you click get your hands dirty, it'll list all the different times where you can come out to one of our garden spaces or the farm, and you might help plant stuff or weed or all sorts of things, whatever it's going on. So those are usually on weekdays and weekends, just depending on the location. We also have a program where we help distribute produce to preschools and other community partners. So we source from organic farmers. It's available at for free for most of those folks. And so you can actually help pack those bags. It's actually a lot of fun to do that. You can volunteer at our events. We also do community kitchens where folks come together and help cook and share a meal once a month. So lots of different fun opportunities. In terms of our big events, we do have 2 plant sales in the year, which is the largest organic edible plants in the world, I think, at least in Seattle or Washington. So we have one in March and again in May. So that's when, like in March, you can get all your lettuces and greens and cool season crops. And then in the first weekend in May, you get all your tomatoes and peppers and basil. And anyway, so they're really big events. They're fun. We always have a good time, and you volunteer or just attend. And then in September, we also have a farm fest at the Rainier Beach Farm, where there's just lots of celebration of the urban farm and all the different things. So lots more to share. I'll just mention on the website also has some online resources. So, different garden almanac, different information that we've just accumulated over the years, different topics on composting, recipes. So just another place to kind of maybe check out, see what's going on. We also have a marketplace where I have to emphasize, even if you're already gardening, I encourage you to buy the Maritime Northwest Garden Guide. It's a month-by-month book, so you kind of flip through and it'll tell you, oh, it's September. This is all the things you can be doing in the garden. Here's what you can sow outdoors or sow indoors. So it's just really easy to kind of flip through it. And then it has several different charts where it by month will kind of tell you, oh, okay, you can still plant garlic in this month or tomato, so it just, instead of all that living in your brain, or if you forget, it's just a great resource. I know they also sell it at or I've seen it's like at PCC and other stores, but you can also get it online. So shout out to the Maritime Northwest Garden Guide, but also other books and resources that are kind of curated here on our website, and much more. But that's probably enough for that. I think now I was just going to spend a little time, figuring out how much time I have left, just going into some, I need to move my Zoom out of the way, sharing a few tips on just a few crops you might be thinking about growing or that you could grow now that we're getting into summer. So the first one is beans. These are green beans. I love growing these. They're incredibly easy to grow if you're looking for an easy thing to grow. Beans grow like nobody's business. This is what they look like. I mean, it's literally like a pinto bean or a black bean. Like that's the seed. The bean that we eat is the seed. So not everybody, that's like a revelation sometimes if you haven't been around it before. So you can also grow beans to save and eat them as dried beans, but I love eating them fresh like that. So you get your beans. You do need to decide whether you're planting pole beans, and pole like a pole you're holding. And that's what this picture shows, a beautiful, cute little trellis where the beans are growing up. And pole beans, they will grow 10 feet. They'll just keep growing. So you really do need something that you can give them to grow on. Or you can grow bush beans. So bush meaning they form a small bush. And those would be great in a container, but they also work just fine in a garden bed. They're not going to get tall. They're just going to fill out as a little bush, and they'll tend to have all their beans come on at one time, whereas pole beans, they'll keep growing throughout the whole season. So I kind of like having both because sometimes I just want a whole bunch of beans and sometimes I just, I'll just harvest them as they grow. So make that decision, decide, make sure you plan ahead for a trellis. Here's a cute example we often do at our children's gardens where you can make a little bean tower or a little hideaway. And it's good for adults too, but kids especially love those. So you can have, get food out of it, but also joy. And what's cool with their roots of beans and other legume plants is they're actually forming little nodules with soil bacteria, and they're fixing nitrogen from the air into the soil. So then the plants can use that nitrogen. It's one of the few ways of how nitrogen can get into the soil, and the plants and the bacteria are doing it for you. So it just means you have to use less fertilizer, which is always nice. So and beans are one of the plants that do this. So do peas. So anyway, so it's very cool that is a thing in nature. And you can also get purple beans. They usually will turn green when you cook them, but they're a lot easier to pick because you can see a bright purple bean. When they're green, it's like you miss them. You like pick them all and then you walk by again and you miss 20. So you can buy ones that are purple, kind of cool. So that's beans. I know I'm just kind of sharing some quick tips, ideas. Tomatoes, not everybody loves tomatoes, but a lot of people do love tomatoes in one form or another. Just like bush beans, they either are going to be where you need to trellis them, and those, instead of being called whole tomatoes, those are called indeterminate, meaning it's indeterminate. They just keep growing forever. So they need some, and it'll say when you buy them, it'll say indeterminate. That just means they need a trellis to grow on. Or they make determinate. It's determined, it's done. They are going to be more like a bush. And similarly, they'll tend to have one big yield. So a lot of sauce tomatoes, you want to make a bunch of tomato sauce, you want one big yield, versus indeterminate that'll just keep growing throughout the season. So just something to be mindful of when you're buying. And if they don't say the word determinate, they'll have a little D, the letter D next to the name. And that means it's determinate. So that's going to be a much smaller. So cherry tomatoes, also decide, do you want to grow the larger or cherry tomatoes? Cherries are going to grow a lot easier to grow here in our climate because it can be tricky to get things to grow as larger tomatoes are harder to ripen in the Northwest. So you might want to stick with cherry tomatoes or smaller tomatoes. And if you're growing those indeterminate that keep growing forever, you actually do need to prune them a lot and keep them down to maybe 1 or 2 or 3 main trunks. And this picture shows where it's kind of just one trunk for each of those poles, but then you plant a bunch of them. That's because if you let them just do all their stuff, they grow too big and you won't get a lot of ripe tomatoes. So you actually do have to be quite brutal in keeping them down to just 1 to 3 primary sort of trunks of the tree, of the tomato, which can be hard to do, but it's for the best. When you first plant them, you can actually cut off like 2/3 or so of the plant, and then you bury it, and those where you cut will form roots, and then it will have this super strong root system. You don't have to, but it's one of those tips that a lot of gardeners and farmers will do, because then the plant doesn't mind that happening to it, will get new roots and be good to go. They also like being watered, not from above. Don't water their leaves because that can promote some diseases and other problems. So try and do surface water. What you should do anyway is always water the soil, not the plants. So this is just a picture of drip irrigation where tomatoes will be happier. They also like consistent watering. If you forget and then you water them too much, they'll often split, which is unfortunate. So consistent watering and just water the soil, and your plants will be very, very happy. They also, this time of year, like a little extra protection. So here's some, they're called wall of water. There's all sorts of different things you can do. These are just little plastic things that you fill with water, and they're not watering the plant at all. They're just adding as insulation. So the water warms up from the sunlight, and it just keeps the tomatoes warmer because they're going to be pretty cold until we get into like July around here. So just another little thing you might see out there and wonder what's going on. And then real quick, I was going to say for some tips for basil, because this is another one this is the time when people are thinking about growing basil. I love basil. Basil also really doesn't like that. Like it would prefer it not to be below 60. We're like barely getting up to 60 right now. So one is you might wait until June to do anything with basil. Like don't feel like you have to grow it in May, but some people will come up with these cloches and plastic where they're just creating like little mini greenhouses, and the basils will love that, as will tomatoes. But you know, you don't have to do anything like that. Here's somebody growing some corn in this cute little like milk jug they've like cut, and then it's just adding a little warmth and insulation. So little things like that can make a big difference for some of these summer crops like basil, tomatoes, eggplants, peppers. Um, when you're harvesting basil, you want to get the most out of it, you want to actually harvest a lot, and you cut down. You can kind of see on this diagram, you cut, it always grows in these two leaves, and then it has two little new leaves that are about to grow out. So you kind of cut it like you're going to cut it off, but then it'll grow back. Like you can see on the right, it like forms two new stems where there was one. And then you cut those and then they form a new. So it basically fills out and becomes this beautiful, productive shrub almost. So don't just like pick one leaf off, like go ahead and just cut it down, and it'll respond, and you'll have more basil than you know what to do with, besides making pesto. And then basil, the other thing is it does like nitrogen and fertilizer. So unless you've planted it with your beans and they're sharing the nitrogen they fix in the soil, organic fertilizers are perfectly good, important things. You need to feed your soil and feed your plants because we're taking all the food out of the system, but just make sure it's organic. And so we often will use something like a fish fertilizer because it's full of nitrogen. It's a little stinky, so just know that. But it's a good example of basil. A lot of times it starts getting a little yellow and sad looking. It probably just needs some fertilizer. It's a very heavy feeder. So that will go far with your gardening adventures as well. Okay, that's what I was gonna share, and I'll make sure there's time for the
Yeah.
or questions.
Yeah, no, thanks, Chris. We are still waiting for our other speaker to join us, unless they've popped on and I don't see them, which if you're here, Denise or somebody from Washington Native Plant, go ahead and raise your hand like we did at the beginning to find Chris, and we will get you, ready to present. But we did have a couple questions in the chat, so let's go over those. Somebody wanted to know if you knew the name of the purple beans. I think they're just called purple beans, aren't they?
Yeah, I don't, off the top of my head, I don't. There's a lot of different ones. So
Yeah.
when you see the seed packets, the pictures will show them purple, and they might have cute names like purple. I don't, but there's plenty out there, and so yeah, just look for the ones that are purple.
Yeah, I think the folks in this group can call them UW beans or Husky
Oh, there you
beans.
go, husky beans.
And that's what we should think of them as.
Love it.
Corey wanted to know if snow peas can be grown successfully in a container.
Probably. I mean, a lot of things you can grow in containers. The things that will grow best are things that tend not to grow too big, but you can still do. So container gardening is a wonderful thing to do, but just know going into it that my colleague always talks about it like a fish in a fish bowl in your house needs a ton of like, you need to feed it, you need to change the water, you need to add a little bubbler. I don't know. It takes a lot because there's nothing, it's just a bowl of water. Whereas there's a fish in the ocean provides everything it needs. It's got all the nutrients, all the food, all that. It's like, so it's, so growing a plant in a container, it doesn't have access to a lot of soil resources because it's a very sterile, small environment. It heats up fast. So just know that your container gardening is always going to be a little trickier and harder than in-ground gardening, no matter what. It's not quite the same. And so to compensate for that, one of the main things, if you have the space, the larger the container, especially, doesn't have to be too deep, like more than a foot or two is, any more than that's probably too deep, but large size, the larger you can get, the happier the plant will be. Usually a plant above ground should have as much space below ground. So some plants, you look at this big, even a kale, it actually needs like a fairly large container to thrive. So anyway,
Okay.
so yeah.
All right. How long can we wait longer before we plant tomatoes?
Yes, please do. No, it's fine to plant them now. I see a lot of people that plant them in like April, and they're like basil. They're like, they would be happy if the overnight lows were like 60, which is not right now.
I would
So
also be happy if the overnight lows were
I know, right?
60. Yeah.
It's like, anyway, so just to say you can, I planted mine now. It's fine. Um, but this is when covering like with some plastic, those wall of waters, as what anything you can do to help. Even at night, sometimes I just get a regular black plant pot. I just put it over top like a little cap. That way I know it gets like an extra degree or two. So, but that all said, there's not a lot of benefit from getting in them now because everything's so cold. They're not going to put on a lot of growth. So it's really fine to wait until like June, and
Mhm.
then they'll be just as fine, if not better, than if you had started in April or May.
Okay, so you mentioned planting basil with beans. Is this a suggested plant pairing? And what are some other plants that we should plant together because they help each other?
Oh, yes, I would say that is a good example of what sometimes is called companion planting. Um, and in that case, as I mentioned, it's helpful because beans as well as peas, they all are very low nitrogen and they actually generate nitrogen. And then something like basil, lettuce, kale, anything with a lot of green, broccoli, leafy growth, they want a lot of nitrogen. So you're growing two things together that that can do well. And there's a million, like some people are like, oh, I forget what they are. Like tomatoes love basil and carrots love, I don't know, onions, or some of those are because some plants, especially herbs or even onions, they pests don't like them as much. So they can kind of keep some pests away. But a lot of it is actually just thinking about like if I'm planting something like a root crop, like a beet, it's using a lot of it's forming this big root in the soil. So maybe then I'm planting something next to it like basil that's, more focusing on leaf growth. And so the
Mhm,
nutrients they're using, one is building out this big root, one's forming leaves. So they're very complementary. And also from a space perspective, they're
mhm.
taking up different um, physical spaces. And so you can start to pair things together like that. Or the other one I always love is if you have something like pole beans, they're going to create a shadow. So you either put them on the north end where you're like the edge of the bed, you're not going to grow anything, or you plant something that doesn't like as much sun behind them or underneath
Mm.
them, like lettuce. If you want to try growing lettuce in the summer, it tends to bolt really quickly. But if it's in the shade of your beans or in a cute those little tunnels, then it's getting that natural shade and it'll be a lot happier and cooler. So there's a million of those, but those are just a few of the ones that I tend to think about.
Oh, I love those. Yeah, okay, let's see what else. I'm just gonna keep going with questions if that's okay. And once again, I will do a shout out if my folks from Washington or Native Plants are here. Please raise your hand and we'll get you presenting. So we have two fertilizer questions. One is liquid fertilizer better than dry? And two, curious about natural ways to boost nitrogen in the soil.
Okay. So liquid and dry fertilizers, they both work. The main difference is the dry fertilizers tend to be like organic fertilizers. They're slower release. So what you're doing is you're feeding the soil microbes, and as they are eating those organic stuff, that's what's then creating nutrients that become available for the plants to take up. And that can take a long time. So you maybe are adding your fertilizer at the very beginning of the season, and maybe it's providing food in a few months or weeks. It varies. So it's more thinking that I'm going to be adding some organic fertilizers maybe at the beginning of the gardening season, just because I know it's going to kind of sustain that growth, versus liquid, which they are immediately available. So I would, for example, when I'm planting my greens in March, April, it's still cold. It's actually too cold for the soil microbes to do very much. So I've added solid fertilizers, knowing that once the soil warms up, they'll start working. But in the meantime, I immediately want to do a little liquid fertilizer, and that will add some immediate nitrogen available to my greens that otherwise they wouldn't get. And so that's how I often will kind of use both of them.
Mhm.
Um,
I
and
love
then
that.
Other ways to add nitrogen, honestly, the ways that at Tilth we usually think about are doing those tips like planting peas, legumes, fava beans, beans, or you can plant what's called a cover crop, something like clover,
Mhm.
or more peas. And you usually that's something you plant kind of over the fall and winter. And those are all ones that help to fix atmospheric nitrogen into the soil naturally. So incorporating those into your gardening, and those will be some of the best ways. The other things you can do is just in general use organic fertilizers. If you, I love worm composting. If you're into or want to explore worm composting, you can make that's some of the best natural fertilizer you can make yourself from your own food waste, and close the loop as right away. So, but that's another adventure.
Yeah,
But
I
I
love that.
recommend that.
And somebody needs to repurpose the bean song and maybe change it to beans, beans, the nitrogen fruit instead of the
I love
musical
it.
fruit. Yeah. I feel like somebody at Tilth should get on that. All right. So we've got some more questions, so we're going to keep going. Any suggestions on low-cost trellis systems for growing tomatoes or snap peas, and favorite resources to show you how to build a simple greenhouse or trellis?
Great questions. Trellises, and I know this from my own adventures in trellising. Um, sometimes you'll see stuff out there that's like overbuilt and over constructed. Um, Oftentimes for something like peas, bamboo and twine, like string, that's all you need. Or sticks, you don't got bamboo, use some sticks. Tomatoes tend to be heavier fruit. So thinking about just how, and if you don't know, you'll have to just grow it and try it. But like things that are heavier, tomatoes mostly, or zucchini or squash, they're big, heavy fruit. So they're going to need something more substantial. So at our farm here, for example, we use these metal posts that are called T-posts. They're available at hardware stores. They're often used for fencing, but also for trellising. And we just like using those because they're reusable. We know we're going to need a bunch every year. And so we use those, and maybe still some twine or something like that. Or they sell those metal panels, cattle
Mhm.
panels, or different things. So if you know you're going to be using a trellis year after year, then that's where you might make that decision to invest in something that you can just take down and then reuse. My favorite for beans that I've been doing now is I actually bought electrical conduit. So it's just a metal, you build a frame, and then I zip tied, it's called remesh. It's like construction
Mhm.
mesh. I basically just built a simple thing, and then it sits on top of two rebar posts. It's and so I just take it up and out when I'm not using it. It takes like a minute instead of like wrapping twine around a million bamboo stakes and all of that. It takes me 5 minutes to put up, 5 minutes to
Mhm.
go stash behind the shed when I'm done for the season, and it kind of looks nice. It's very, tidy looking. Whatever your garden aesthetic is, but I think that has worked really, really well for my peas. I use it for my tomatoes. Um,
I love
yeah.
that. Um, let's see. So next question. Burying tomatoes deeper to promote additional and stronger root systems also a good practice for other plants?
Yes, that is what it's for. And you can do the same thing with other nightshade family plants. And if you don't know what they are, typically we're talking about tomatoes, peppers. You can do the same
Mhm.
thing. And then potatoes, that's actually like a trick is you plant your potato, it grows, and then some folks will bury the new leaves, and then it grows taller and you just keep burying it, because then all those will turn into more potatoes. You don't have to do that, but that's actually how a lot of people grow potatoes, is they keep mounding them up. Because those plants in particular, their
Mhm.
roots respond, their leaves, they respond in that way. But other plants, you don't do
Yeah.
that with kale or lettuce or
Yeah.
anything like
That's what
that.
my grandma would do with potatoes. But then at the end of the season, she would make us dig out the starter potatoes, which was not fun. All right, let's move on to some container gardening questions. And a couple of you asked questions that I actually had, so I feel
Okay.
like it's a good question. So the first, I'm going to ask you two questions together. The first is to grow basil, like a large shrub. How large a container would you need? A, and B, This is my question too. How many seasons can you reuse the soil in your container before you replace it completely?
So, and that's,
Follow-up question, what
yeah,
do you do with that soil that's in your container?
these are all great questions. So for the first one about basil or any container plant, I mentioned it very quickly when I was sharing earlier, but, and you might not know this until you've been gardening for a while, but however big the plant is above ground is how big ideally, at least it will be below ground. So when I picture a very large, healthy basil shrub, it might be like a foot, maybe 2 feet, I mean, a foot and a half tall. And, it's like, it's big. Now, it doesn't
Mm-hmm,
have to be. There's smaller varieties, blah, blah, blah. But for the most part, think about, well, however big this is above ground or how I want it, I can picture it being, that's ideally how big the container is. But that all said, most plants more than 12 to even maybe 18 inches deep, you're not going to get a lot of extra by going deeper. Like if you have a 3 foot trough, a lot of times people will fill that in with like concrete blocks because that bottom foot, none of the plants are going to benefit from anything down there. So you're just filling it with soil that never gets used. But I do think about having it maybe wider because there's just more room for those roots to grow. So try and get away from like the little tiny containers because they'll also just dry out so fast that you have to like water them multiple times a day. So
mm-hmm.
hopefully that helps in terms of thinking about that.
Yeah.
In terms of the question about like the soil. So to start
Mm-hmm,
with, if you're growing in a container, you're actually not using any soil at all. There should be no soil in that container. What you're using is something, they might call it potting soil. Ideally, they call it potting mix. It's a completely soilless, no dirt in there at all. What it is filled with is compost, organic matter, perlite, vermiculite, little things that either help with drainage or help absorb water. So it's a very artificial, it can be organic, but it's actually not soil. And the reason we're doing all that is because if you were just to fill your container with pure soil, it's going to compact over time in that small environment. And then your plant roots don't get any oxygen. And it can impact drainage and it can cause a lot of problems. So whenever you're filling your containers, make sure whatever you're purchasing, because you're probably buying something, make sure that it says like container mix, potting mix, even though it might say raised bed. And if you look on the contents, you'll see that's all like organic stuff and nothing about soil. And that's the right stuff to use. So make sure you're using that. And then once you're using it, each year, the organic stuff in it, the compost, is going to shrink and get used by the plants. So every single year, you should plan on mixing in compost. Maybe it's like a quarter of the volume, like getting it back up to that
mm-hmm.
nice full level. So every year, you're adding in fresh organic matter as needed because that's what the plants are using up as they grow. So as long as you just keep refreshing it with the compost, you should be good. You don't necessarily have to get rid of the old soil. You're just filling in
Okay.
as it shrinks. And then if at some point you're completely decide you just want to, and this is for container gardening, maybe it's going to use up all the nutrients. Maybe you decide, okay, I'm just going to toss that what's in there. That's generally would be compostable, like in city pickup if you decide that, or maybe you have a spot you can just mix it in somewhere else. Like you
Mm-hmm.
don't have to don't put it in the trash, but um, yeah,
That would be an interesting trash day for sure.
yeah.
Okay, let's move on to so I have two more, well, I actually have more than two questions. So I'm going to ask you, this is a good one, Tamarack. Thanks for asking. Is it a lost cause to plant a garden in a space that receives sun for the first half of the day and shade for the second half of the day?
No, that's perfect. So when you have less than full sun, like 8 hours, which I like my front yard used to get full sun, and then our neighbors have this beautiful redwood tree. I would never really want it cut down, but if it were to get cut down, I would suddenly have a lot more sun in my garden. It's okay. Um, it's okay. So you're not going to be successful growing things like tomatoes or peppers. There's a lot of things that you'll see on a seed packet or learn about the plants that really need a full day of sun. So if you only have that half day, then you're actually going to be just fine growing a lot of greens. So lettuces, kales, collards, parsley, cilantro, arugula, peas. Like you can still grow a ton of stuff. You just have to, anything that says to grow in the early spring is probably like outdoors. That's probably going to be something that's pretty okay with like half day sun.
Mm-hmm.
Slash, it might even grow better. Like I have some raspberries that I put in too sunny and too hot of a place, and they actually get a little burned. And in hindsight, I would have put them somewhere that got a little bit of that protection from, especially the afternoon sun as it's setting. That's really hot. That can actually burn up plants. So it's not a bad thing to have protection in the afternoon.
Okay. I love this one because it has the word blight in it. I planted experimental potatoes from the grocery store, but someone told me to throw them out because of blight. Is that a real risk?
Great questions. Um, there is a risk. So when you buy seed potatoes, they've been specially grown and bred to be usually, hopefully, to be disease free. And when you don't, and you just use up a grocery store potato, it doesn't mean you're gonna like destroy your garden or never be able to grow potatoes again. But you're increasing the odds that you might be introducing some soil pathogens or diseases that are going to affect your ability, to grow potatoes. So I always just go ahead and buy the seed potatoes because then I don't have to worry about it. But it doesn't mean that they're full of disease. It just means they haven't been, you don't know what they might have
Mhm.
with them. So it's a little bit of a risk, but
Okay.
yeah.
So let's go back to containers, and this time I'm adding raised beds. So two questions. How do you add potting mix to containers with perennials inside?
Great
And
question.
that's part one. This is part two, but it's
Okay.
in no way related other than they're both containers. For a 4x8 raised beds that are 10 inches tall, can slash should the bottom layer be gravel or something to increase drainage?
All good questions. So for anything in perennials in containers, they actually will need a little bit of, like you can grow fruit tree in a container. Um, if it's living in a container, then maybe not every year, but at least every 2, 3 years, you actually, if you can, if your container's too big and it doesn't work, you can't. You actually want to take the whole thing out of the container. And again, this is thinking of like a fruit tree or something with a lot of these roots. And then you're
Mhm.
actually going to prune off maybe like a third of the root. Like you're basically trying to shrink it so that it can go back in the pot and then grow again. And you're doing that on a constant basis because otherwise it'll get pot bound and all its roots will it'll eventually die. So in that case, you actually would take it out, prune away the root. It feels, if you haven't done it before, it feels like you're just killing your poor plant, but it actually, same with house plants. It's the exact same with house
Yeah.
plants. It will be for the best. And so, when you're, so that anyway, so then when you're putting that back in, that's when you would fill back in with some fresh compost or potting mix as part
Great.
of that process for the perennials. Um, and then for the raised bed question, um, generally we discourage folks from doing anything with drain rock or like don't put anything in the bottom of your container, like rocks or like it's just a practice that in reality doesn't make a ton of sense. I'm not sure what to think about. Because what that can just create layers in the soil that do funky things with how water flows, and it's unnecessary. All the drainage should just be coming from the soil you're adding itself, and then as long as that soil contains compost and you're refreshing it with fresh compost on a regular basis, doesn't have to be a lot, but just a little bit each year. Compost itself is what will help with drainage as well as like holding on to moisture for your plants. So you don't need to do any extra drainage per se. For containers, they're small enough that they do need at least some drainage hole for the excess liquid
Mhm.
to, flow out. But don't be adding in like rocks or pot shards or anything on the bottom of the pot. Just make sure it has a drainage hole, and then whatever mix you're using has more than adequate drainage.
Would you
Uh,
recommend the same thing for a raised bed?
yeah, same thing for raised beds. I would either, depending on if they're like a bed on top of soil, then I wouldn't necessarily put anything down. Or like no, like just it'll
Hmm.
just go into the soil. Or like in my house, I have sometimes trouble with moles. And so I did put down a layer of what's called hardware cloth. It's like a
Hmm.
mesh. And that was actually good because it prevented the moles from, everything could drain, but it prevented moles from coming up into my bed. It's finally kind of wearing away, and now I'm getting a couple moles in the bed, which isn't a big deal. But that actually, I'm glad I did that because for 10 years or so, it kept the moles out. So
Nice. All right. So I'm going to ask you two completely unrelated questions again. And then I think depending on time, these might be our final two. Moles are the worst, Lindsay. Y'all are not wrong. Although I think Jan's got some legit complaints here. Wanting suggestions for ways to deter rabbits. Immediately I read that as deer because deer used to get in my yard growing up, and they would eat all the apples off the tree, but not any of the windfall, right? Like, because they were too good to pick the apples up off the ground. Any suggestions to deter rabbits? And I'm going to add other rodents, squirrels, rats, raccoons, neighborhood bandits from eating your newly planted herbs and vegetables, A. And B, my seedlings always come up leggy. How do I prevent this and I don't get a ton of sunlight?
cool. So for pests, they are just a reality. We have plenty here at the farm where I'm at, the Arena Reach Farm. You just walk around and you see the rabbits. I think what I think most gardeners will do is do a lot of covering the beds. There's a material, the brand name is Remay, but it's also called row cover. It's this, usually it's kind of a woven or a spun fabric. It's usually kind of a white color. It allows most of the sunlight and it allows water to pass through, and you just cover your bed, and put rocks or however you want to hold it down. And you might build it over a little structure. And that essentially nothing can get in.
Mhm.
Rabbits, deer, pests. It's sort of they're very safe as long as it's secure. And a rabbit is not going to get through that as long as it's secure or grow in a raised bed. If it's high enough, rabbits can't get into that. The only downside is that if you're growing something that needs pollinators, they can't get in to pollinate your
Mm.
tomatoes because they're covered. So you do have to think about what might happen if my bed is covered. But so we do a lot of covering things with that, or you can use plastic. You can do it in like more of a greenhouse setting. Of course, fencing for deers, but you have to invest. That's a lot.
Mhm.
And then I know there's different plants that supposedly, deer don't like as much. So maybe you're trying to dissuade them. I also heard a tip, I have not tried it, for bunnies, that maybe if you have space in your yard, you plant like a big patch of clover, and it's like you want to like draw them over to somewhere else where they're eating their favorite little snacks, and then they might not be as interested in your beds.
I
But
feel like that just rewards their bad behavior.
I know, I haven't tried it, but I can understand the thinking. Um, but anyway, and then for if you're growing like plants are getting leggy, like let's say you're growing things indoors, usually they're just leggy because there's not enough light. So the only way to really address that is by supplementing with like, the grow lights, and you'd have to get like a little system that has really lighting very, very close to the plant. Otherwise, it's going to keep reaching, to get it what it can. And so that it really is just down to getting in grow lights and having a little setup. And most plants will get leggy until I mean, it's not a natural environment. So it's a little bit of legginess is normal, but the grow lights would help.
All right. I keep saying that these are going to be the last questions, but then I keep lying. Two completely unrelated questions and actually three unrelated questions. First, for the covering Rome, can you spell that Oh, thank you, Chris. I see you got that in there. You rock. Um, all right. How do I prevent bolting? I cannot grow broccoli. You can ask my sister to do it. That's what I do. That might not be a solution for everyone since you don't all know my sister. And can you use fresh cedar chips in your garden for mulch?
Good questions. Some plants will just bolt. Um, with broccoli, that's something you plant pretty early when it's still cold. But if we have insane weather, which we'll continue to have, and if you have 90 or 80-degree days, that's what's going to tell plants to bolt. So part of that is just the new world we live in. Um, but just make sure you're not, if you're planting something late in the season, then it's going to bolt. So some things you don't like lettuce. I'm not going to plant that in July typically, necessary or June. Anyway, so you have to get familiar with when to plant things. And some varieties are also, if you read their packets, they'll say bolt resistant. And so that just means you're probably gonna have a better chance, or buy things that have like Siberian or Russian, like if they or Arctic, if they have those words in their name, they're probably they're good for our climate, and so you might have more success with those. But yeah, that's for bolting.
I guess I'm
Um,
looking forward to eating that Arctic lettuce this fall or this year. And then cedar chips.
oh yeah, so
Yes or no?
um depends. Uh, there's some misinformation out there that's like, so basically cedar chips, wood chips of any kind,
Hmm.
arborist chips, very good mulch for covering your soil. Um, Ideally, they work best where you have like perennials, woody shrubs, and such. People tend to not use them as much if you're growing annual veggies, just because they're kind of chunky and hard to, like, if you're trying to mend the bed or weed, do it, like they kind of just get in the way. They do use up a tiny, tiny bit of nitrogen as part of their natural decomposition process, but not as much as some people are like, they get freaked out and they think that wood chips are going to like steal all the nitrogen from their plants. That's not true at all.
Especially if you plant beans.
There you go. So yeah, don't be afraid of them, but use them. We usually use like leaves, straw, compost, even like weeds that are like we've
Hmm.
pulled, like use those as like a natural mulch for your annual veggies, but wood chips are great for everything else.
All right. Well, Chris, we have taken so much of your time, and I appreciate so much you being flexible. For all of you who came, thank you for joining us. This is being recorded, so you can watch this again. I don't know about the rest of you, but I feel very inspired and engaged to go do some yard work. And like several of you have said in the comments, also cannot wait to check out the future Tilth classes. I don't know why, I just thought they were for kids. But I am in. So thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Yep. Bye.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Julie.